Okay, so in this second part of the demo, we'll look at how to apply material surfaces to your objects, and then also be able to learn how to actually apply texture-based images around an object. So to do that, we're going to actually probably turn off some of these lights to work with this part of the exercise so we can get some accurate lighting for color rendition and those types of things. So what you probably want to do is go through like your list of lights that are probably in your outliner view over here in the upper right, and look for each of your light sources that are listed. Again, they'll use like a little light bulb icon or an orange light bulb icon. And you can select and you can delete those by hitting the X key out in your viewport area to delete them accordingly. Now leave at least one light in your scene somewhere for starters.
Did I just turn them off for now?
You can turn them off, you can leave them on, that's up to you. The point of what I want to do is have a basic light source in the scene though that represents color well.
Okay.
Or accurately. So what you really want back in your scene is a simple white light. You can either A, turn off your current lights by going to outliner and just turning them off and then adding one new light.
I have all of them off, but the colors are still showing.
That is because it doesn't actually make them fully invisible in render. Are you in render view? Or are you in material?
Material.
Okay. Yeah, it may not be... wait a minute, let me delete that light. Let's drop in another light. Check your render view after you turned all the other ones off.
It's black.
Yeah. So where's your current light located?
Right above it. It's a spotlight.
Okay.
Sir, I deleted my camera.
If you deleted your camera for now, that's okay. You can always add a new one if you delete one, by the way. You just go to the add command and you'll find a brand new camera waiting for you. Right there. You may want to move that light around if you're still playing with it in your scene. If you've created a light that you can't see, make sure it's actually over your objects. Look in each 3D view and see where it's actually located. And make sure it's not great distances away from your object too.
Oh boy, am I getting confused by this.
Yeah. That's where you got to be careful when you coordinate between those different views. You may have to zoom out also when coordinating lights in a scene to make sure that things are where they're supposed to be. But that's why I say look at every single point of view that you have open and make sure that each one shows it where you're actually wanting it to show. Because if it's not, then it's not really where you think it is right now. All right. Now again, I just went back and added like a basic white light to my scene, and then I either deleted all my other lights or I went to outliner and I turned off my other lights one by clicking the little eyeball icon for those respective lights. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to work with shading one of my objects for starters. So select one of your objects. Again, make sure it's well lit in your scene. I'm going to go to the monkey. And if you want to isolate an object on scene or on your screen, you can use the / button on your number pad. That's the key right above number 9 on your number pad on an extended keyboard. So it is not the / in the middle of your normal traditional keyboard area. It's over on the extended pad on the far right. But hit / and what it does is that it makes all other objects in your scene invisible and it centers the current object you're editing on. And you can hit / again to exit that view as well. Now, with this view currently on, we're going to actually go in and we're going to manipulate the different colors and materials for the object. And every object, to some degree, has a base, what's called a base material. It has a default one if you don't change it, which is just kind of a pale white. But if we want to add something new to it, we'll need to come over to our property panel. And we're going to go into properties, and we're going to look for an icon that looks like a little orange sphere. Click on that orange sphere with one of your objects selected in your scene. And you should get a pop-up property that looks like this. There's not really much to look at. What you want to do is we want to add a new material to the object. So click on New. And when you click on New, you should now have lots of material options to work with. Again, you can only apply materials to mesh objects. So if you don't have that present in your scene, then you're not going to see this option. But let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you can edit under the materials property. First off, to label these as we go, you get an instant preview on a preview form or default shape for seeing how your material is applied on a surface. They give you a strip of icons here next to that preview image that you can actually look at your material up against. So the standard usually gives you the sphere, which is a basic. You can also look at it as a flat shade. You can also look at it if your shade was applied to a cube form. They also use the monkey inside that window as a preview form for non-normative objects if you want to preview what your shade might look like on a weird organic form. Bear in mind that if you click on these, they do not change your shape out in your window. You may notice that that doesn't happen. This is just for previewing your shade on different standard surfaces. That's it. So I'm going to leave it on sphere for now. And I'm going to go down to the next part of the material editor. Down below that, there are some other settings that are very specific that affect the surface material, like diffuse. Diffuse is actually just a fancy word for color. It is the surface color of your object. So if you want to change up the surface color, click on the white strip down below diffuse, and you'll get your little color picker pop up, and you can change the surface color of your object. Now another thing that you can also set is the intensity of that surface color inside the diffuse area. I usually have diffuse pumped all the way up to a 1.0 for the setting, rather than having it reduced in quality. Gives it a nice bright surface tone to work with. And then after that, you have another setting that you can change called specular. Specular basically changes, if you look at your little preview window up here inside the material area, when you change out specular, that actually changes the quality of highlight shine on the surface of an object. So you can either make an object have a very high specularity or sort of shine to it, or you can reduce it to where it has a very flat kind of surface with very little to no shine on the surface at all. Interesting thing is you can also change the color of specular shine or specular highlights by, again, changing the color strip for specular. And so then you can actually have it project a different tone onto your object for the highlight color. Both diffuse and specular will translate into an augmented reality software, just as kind of a little note there. I'm going to flip my specular back to white for now, just for simple displaying. You can also change the hardness level of specular, so the power of the highlight shine can be controlled by that hardness factor. All right, if you hop down, we're going to keep going down the property panel here. Go down to where it says transparency. So if you activate transparency by checking the little box next to the title, you can actually affect the ability to see through the object. So to affect the transparency of the object or its opacity, we can use what's called this little alpha slider right here. So if we drop the alpha value down, you will be able to start seeing through your object out its other side. So on my screen, it opens up the preview and it starts making it invisible. It does kind of highlight on my screen the underlying wireframe skeleton of the object, which is not technically a visible feature when you output the model. It's just letting you know that it's becoming invisible. But that's how you can make an object transparent. It also shows that outline material underneath or the wireframe when you're in material mode. Just so you're aware of that. But that's how you can add transparency. So if you want to kind of simulate glass or some other kind of see-through surface, that's a way to approach it. All right, I'm going to turn off transparency here. Another one I'd like to highlight is the one called mirror, right below it. Mirror is what it says. It actually produces reflective properties on your model. So if you check the box for mirror and up the reflective values, you probably won't see, just as kind of a note here, you may not see the quality of the reflection when you're in object isolation mode and when you're not looking at a fully rendered image. So I'm going to turn up my mirror effect and I'm going to get out of object isolation. Remember, to get out of the isolation mode, you have to click that / key on your number pad. And then also enter render for display shading. So switch to rendered for view shading. And if you go back to your object, you should notice that it now has a little bit more of a reflective property on its surface, but it all depends. If there aren't any surrounding objects, there's not going to be anything to reflect off of. Just as kind of a key point there. So that's kind of a basic of how that property works. Now, all of your objects by standard in Blender have a what's called flat shading system applied until you change that. That's why when I look at this monkey, it still looks very angular looking whenever I even have it rendered. But let's say that we want to change that. So what I'm going to do is we're going to switch modes for a second to change the way that we apply surface materials to an object. So to switch modes, go down to the bottom menu and go to where it says Object Mode. Switch it to Edit. All right, once you've done that, go over to your tool shelf over on the left-hand side of the screen and go to where it says Shading UV. So again, to get to this menu, you go to Edit Mode first, switch to Edit Mode, and then make sure you have your tool shelf on the left visible, and go to the tab that says Shading /UV. And then click on this button here under Faces that says Smooth. Now exit Edit Mode and go back to Object Mode. And you should notice that your object now has a smooth kind of application of the materials to the surface. Keep in mind that smooth shading does not change the polygon design of your object. If your object was really rigid underneath, it still is. That's why there's still very sharp angles around my object when it tries to wrap the material around it. But it changes the quality of the render to becoming a much smoother surface now. So the accuracy of reflection is much more interesting on the surface.
Suzanne does it smooth too.
Yeah. Again, Suzanne is a very simple polygon design. We can amp it up though. We'll do that later. But that just gives you a little bit of a preview of how you can see the change.
It looks like gold.
So again, let's get back into material shade preview. And I'm not going to really go through any of the other properties under the material property panel part because those are kind of the basics that you really need to know at this point. Again, with any combination of those, you can make all kinds of different simple surface materials. There is a link inside of the document for this part of the project under exercise 3 that you'll find that takes you to a wiki page that online users have developed, like a recipe cookbook of different shader materials that you can borrow. So they've got all kinds of things from different types of metals like chrome and gold to other things that look like dirt or kind of rust. Lots of interesting stuff on there, even different types of glass and plastic. So feel free to peruse that when you get to that part. All right. So now that we've got that up, I'm gonna turn off some of these special properties that I turned on for my object, like mirror and transparency. I'm gonna just turn those off for now and leave it with just the basic shaders like diffuse and specular active. All right. What we're going to do next is we are going to add a texture to our object. So this is where things get a little interesting. So to add a texture, we have to go to Texture Properties. That is the next property box next to your materials. It looks like a checkered square, red and white checkered. Click on that. And what you will get on your screen is kind of like what we experienced with materials, an empty texture box. We're going to add a new texture by clicking New. And we're going to navigate this piece by piece here to add a new texture to this scene because it comes in empty initially. Underneath where it says Type, this should be set to image or movie if you want to import a photographic image or some sort of imagery into your object. So leave it at image or movie. You may notice if you click on that though that there are lots of other options. All the other options listed with a checkered icon are ones that can be generated inside of Blender directly. So they have a very different approach to effect on their surface of how they make a texture. But they are not based on an original image that you can import. So go to Image Movie, slide down and go to where it says Image inside your property panel. So again, make sure when you're inside the texture area, select the one that says Image Movie. Slide a little further down in your texture panel to where it says Image. And it should have 2 buttons for New and Open. Go ahead and click on Open. And then from here, you're going to navigate to find your textures. Now, the way that I do it is I use one of these system bookmark options on the sidebar, usually to get to a place fast, like the desktop, which is where I saved my textures to. You can also attempt to use other things like the system button up here at the top to access the hard drive of the computer. But I'm going to go to desktop and I'm going to locate my textures from in there and I'm going to pick out one of these. I'm going to pick out the jackfruit and I'm going to go ahead and click on Open Image up here in the upper right corner of that screen. All right. Now, the effect of opening up a texture with your object, generally speaking, if you're in the materials view, it will probably try to give you some sort of preview of what it will look like on the surface, or in the very least, it will change the base material color, which is what mine's doing. It is not actually giving me a real preview of what it looks like on the surface yet. So at this stage, all we're looking at in Blender is a basic application of an image to an object. Again, it may look very different depending on the texture that you're using, the file that you're using. It may wrap accurately, it may not wrap at all. And that is all dependent on the file you use. Now, I want you to look at this. Inside, when you put that texture on, it should give you a preview image of what it looks like in the texture property. slide a little further down, and you should see under image now information about the image you added to your scene or your object, and it also gives you an image size in there. And sometimes with certain images, like it may not load up the image because it's way too big and it can't preview it, or it's way too small. So it really just depends sometimes for that part. My image is a 2000 by 1500 pixel image area. So it's showing me a preview, but not like a great one on the surface. So there's some other things that we can look at this point. Keep scrolling down in the property editor. Under image mapping, you should have coordinates available that say UV, and then projection is set to flat. If you do not see those options, it may be an error with the texture that you loaded into Blender. It may need to be re-added. If you have to delete it and add it again, just go back up to the top of your texture property area, select the texture property from the list at the top, and then go to the little X, little white X icon where your texture, where it says texture down below that, and click on the X to delete the texture you've added. And then you can go back and add a new one back in.
I should just turn this in. This looks great.
But yeah, sometimes you can get like an instant, you get something instantly that looks really interesting, which is really cool.
I'm proud of this.
All right. But if you click out, like I'm going to switch from material to rendered. And when I go to rendered, it actually shows my texture on my object now. Because sometimes it won't show it in the material preview display. So sometimes that's a nuance, again, in the system based on the texture you have, based on its size of pixel dimension, and based on the object it's wrapping around. Now, like I said a minute ago, when you apply a texture like this on the front end, it just applies it in a default manner with Blender. It doesn't try to figure out your object, it just wraps it in a certain way, which may not be accurate usually. If you look at my object, like here, I'm going to zoom in really close here and render the scene. And I'm going to actually get out of the quad view to see this. Now this is what mine looks like with my texture wrapped around my object. It has literally broken up the texture to basically be projected on almost every single polygon around the object, right? Like see how it's kind of split up into sections around it? So that's not very helpful. That's like really bad shading. So what if we actually wanted that texture to wrap around the object evenly instead of breaking it into 1,000 pieces? Well, what we have to do to make that happen is we have to do something called a UV unwrap. And we may also need to do something called marking a seam on the object to help it understand where it wraps around to. So we'll start off with that. So let's go and do this to make that happen. So I'm going to switch modes, and I'm going to switch to edit mode. So if you want to switch to edit mode, actually a shortcut is tab. If you move your mouse over your shader screens, you can hit that. Make sure that you are not in material display mode, but you're in like solid shading. So switch to solid down below instead of rendered or material. And that'll make your texture and everything disappear, but it's much easier to select and edit with. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to enter object isolation mode. So I'm going to hit that / button on my number pad so that I'm only looking at the monkey or whatever shape you have in front of you. And part of what Blender uses to help identify a way to wrap around an object is a point of origin or a specified area. And so in this case, it uses what's called a seam marker. Much like whenever you put clothing or cloth together, it has to have like a seam edge somewhere that it's indicated that it's stitched together somewhere. So it works the same in here. Like I mentioned last class, it's like wrapping up a present or a gift. That's how it wraps images around models. So it's just wrapping it. It's finding a place to close it off. So we're going to define on this model a place for it to close off properly. So to do that, get in edit mode, deselect your object by hitting A. Again, make sure that you have changed, if you want to be able to see your object a little bit easier, I still recommend going into solid shading instead of rendered or material. After you do that, we're going to go down to our 3D menu at the bottom, and there's an icon down there that's between three little gray cubes next to the word global.
Sir,
Yeah.
I don't see the options.
Do you have it in edit mode?
Oh, I got it.
Okay, there you go. Gotta have it in edit mode if you want to see these things.
Nice.
All right. Now, once you drop it into edit mode, this is where these three icons are available for you. The first one, again, these are like for selecting vertex, edges, or faces. The one we want to use is the one that's called edge. That's the little box in between right here. So turn that on. All right. So let's go ahead and mark the seam on this object. Again, I pulled up edit mode and I went to edge selection. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this collection of edges that run behind the monkey's head. So I'm going to hold down Shift and grab each edge that are and make sure they're each connected. And I'm just going to go around the back. Again, you may have to move and rotate your monkey around to get a good angle on it. And you can use your number pad keys to rotate your object around. At least that's what I recommend. You don't want to try to rotate it with the widget because then it'll start rotating whatever you have selected on screen. So what this is doing is we're going to define the seam line that we want to use on our object. So this is where the texture is going to wrap to. I picked the back of it because it's a little more subtle, you know, and you don't want to have the seam showing up on the front of your object because it looks really strange when it's not seamless. It looks like a big split. So once you have that line defined on your object somewhere, again, I recommend just doing like a single line. If it's a simple object like a cone, for instance, you might want to have just one line selected. I wouldn't try to make a shape out of it because it does help define the object. So just make a single seam for now. And in your toolbar or your tool shelf on the left side of the screen, go to the Shading UV tab. And inside here, go down to where it says Mark Seam and click on Mark Seam. When you do that, your line should kind of highlight red and orange underneath to indicate that it has officially marked it in Blender. So it recognizes it for that object now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do something else to the object to unwrap it properly. So hit A a couple times to select your whole object. And now in that same tool shelf panel, under where it says UVs, select Unwrap, the little black drop down that says Unwrap. Click on that and use the option that says Unwrap. And it's going to base this, what it does is that it rips your model apart into a flat surface based on that seam location. Let me show you on my screen what that actually does. So I'm going to actually move to the UV editor. And I don't want the rendered result. There we go. So this is what it's actually done with the surface of the mesh. Is it's completely flattened it out and stretched it on screen to show me what it's going to look like when it tries to apply a material to the surface. So it's looking at one, two, or really like these two are kind of joined and this is one giant mesh together. These are the eyeballs. Oddly enough, when they designed this model, the eyeballs are floating. They're not actually a part of the model surface. They're independent. But this shows me where I probably broke apart my model where these long edges are. And so it split it in half based on that. So go back to 3D view. And now, if I switch back to a object mode and then go back to rendered, the material is now more accurately wrapped around my object, right? Like I don't have like it applied to every single instance of a polygon around the surface. Much better application. Now here are some other fun things you can do once you apply it to the surface of your object. Go back over to your texture properties and slide down on the tab. And there's a section down here that says Influence. And under Influence is an option for Geometry. And I'm going to click on this one that says Normal, or check the box for it. When you check the box for normal, it actually pulls out of the photographic imagery depth map information or bump map. So it actually projects on the surface or simulates like physical bumps based on the photographic image. So you can actually, you know, kind of de-enhance that or really enhance it to amp up the surface texture. Now it doesn't change the model. Remember, it's just playing with the texture map visualization. That's it. So there's not real bumps in the surface of your model. It's just projected. And that's just with playing kind of this little normals feature that really enhances what's called a bump map inside of your object. So it's kind of fun. Again, you can kind of get interesting surface effects with it. Yeah, it's not too bad.
The face it doesn't.
Yeah. And again, it all depends on how you position that seam on the object is how it also stretches around it. If I had placed my seam in a different location, this would be lit completely differently, or this would be stretched completely differently. I could probably draw the seam now straight down the back of the head from top to bottom, and it would probably stretch more evenly across the front. But if you look down here at the chin, like it's really stretched across the chin area to where the texture is kind of lost because that's the furthest away from the seam. So you have to kind of work with it with the size texture that you have available. But that's how you can apply a texture. Now, other cool things you can do is you can actually multi-layer textures, like in Photoshop. We can add more to it. If we added one, we can add more. So if I go back up to the top of the texture area, there's empty banks here for more texture maps. So each of these other little checkered boxes indicates a place for me to drop a new texture into if I want to, either to test on the model, to have as an option, or to multi-layer over the surface. You can do the same thing in material, by the way. You just click on this and it'll add a new material. But I'm going to add another texture, so I'm going to do this again just to multi-layer it. So I'll select an empty checkerboard spot, hit new, and I'm going to go ahead and pick out a new image to apply. Melon skin. And now on the surface, it has a combination of the two surfaces over the top. So you can kind of see the effect by going back up here and using these checkboxes to have one or the other turned on. So you can kind of see the influence that they have on each other. There's more ways that you can manipulate the quality of each texture and how it affects the one below it or above it. Usually by using things like the color sampling area, or you can come down below and play with these different mixing tools down here in the base. But again, you can kind of get interesting effects when you combine different things together. So it's kind of fun. And again, the texture is affected by the other qualities that I've set for my object. Like whatever I set for my material is also affecting my texture. So if it's really glossy, like the intensity is up, then it stays really glossy on the surface. See, as I turn that down, the gloss goes away. So it's gone, right? Now it's not glossy. So it kind of looks a little flat. That shine, that sort of highlight shine is what sort of makes it feel like it's more three-dimensional. All right. Now that's basically how you apply a texture to a surface without getting too intense with playing with the UV coordinate system, or those types of things, which you're welcome to experiment with. But that gives you just a basic idea of how to apply a texture around an object and how to get more accuracy out of its application to the surface. Couple random things that I wanted to show you guys, like that are kind of related to different parts of the project at this stage. But let's say that we wanted to take like this Suzanne head thing, and we wanted to make the quality of the surface of the object more dense, like less cubic, kind of geometric looking. It's pretty easy. For any object that you design, if you want to smooth out its form, go into edit mode so you can preview it. Go over to your shading and, not shading, go to tools and then go down to smooth vertex. And if you click on smooth vertex a couple times, it will round off as best it can all of your geometry in your object. Now again, it's basing it on the polygons that are available. If you don't have enough, you can actually use the subdivide command inside the tool shelf right here to add more density, design density to the object, and continue to hit smooth. And then when I come out of that, I have a much cleaner, much nicer object on screen. And you can actually do that with anything in Blender. If you do it with a cone, it actually gives you a completely different effect. Or if you use some other rigid object. But it gives you something smoother to play with if you're not looking for the flat shaded polygon kind of look in your object. All right. So that's going to conclude working with textures and materials in this project. Again, feel free to look back over the demo and check things over. And